As Reagan is being sworn in as president, Iran releases the hostages, one last slap in the face of Jimmy Carter. The hostages have been held for 444 days, and it was a tremendous celebration when they came home and a great boost to American national pride. Iran, for their part, had been locked in a war with Iraq, and in reality they exchanged the hostages in exchange for American promises to unfreeze Iranian assets held in America that they needed to pay for the war. But nonetheless, it was a great day to get the hostages back. I certainly remember it. Reagan promised to be an anti-New Deal president. He was going to undo the liberal policies that had reigned supreme since really 1930. The actual change fell far short of this. He did very little to undo these programs. And Reagan, like JFK, FDR, Teddy Roosevelt, Andrew Jackson, will be one of these presidents for whom there develops a cult of personality. Reagan was never terribly popular as president if you look at his approval ratings, but those who supported him, that conservative core that he had, supported him with a really extraordinary fanaticism. Reagan had been backed originally by a small group of wealthy donors, and Reagan talked a lot about the importance of capitalism, a system where the majority of profits go to the owners of businesses, and free markets as opposed to government regulation. He opposed what he called redistribution. That would be welfare programs that help the poor. And he wanted to see flatter and flatter taxes. Reagan and his supporters did not believe that the wealthy should necessarily pay a higher percentage of their taxes than the poor. He was a cold warrior. He wanted to amp up the tensions with the Soviet Union back again. He was angry about the retreat from an interventionist American foreign policy. And he believed that we must support what he considered to be our allies in the war against the Soviet Union, which is to say the various dictators around the world that we had come to back. He talked about Vietnam, the failure of Vietnam being that the public will gave out, that we could have wanted Vietnam if the liberals, if the anti-war people wouldn't have given up on the war. In fact, he's angry that we gave up, he says. He preaches American exceptionalism that justifies an aggressive U.S. foreign policy, that America is somehow different and better than every other nation on the earth, and therefore doesn't have to follow the rules that the other nations have to, because we are, by definition, better. One thing that's become a standard of conservatism at this point is an attack on elites and intellectuals, as if expertise and knowledge is something to be sneered at and looked down upon. Reagan, a former actor, of course, had a carefully crafted public image. There was a tremendous amount of detail paid to how Reagan appeared anytime he appeared in public, and his staff was really a pioneer in that regard. He's the oldest president ever, and although he was in his 70s, he didn't come across that way. He seemed much more energetic and youthful, particularly in the early years of his presidency. Soon after he sworn into office, a crazy guy, John Hinckley, trying to oppress a teenage actress, shoots Reagan. Reagan survives, of course, and much like the assassination attempt, Reagan will survive anything that gets thrown at him. He's sometimes called the Teflon president, as the number of scandals just piles up and up and up in the Reagan administration. Reagan somehow seems to be untouched by all of them. He is often portrayed as detached, not really knowing what's going on in his administration. And of course, later when he gets in trouble, that will be his greatest defense. Essentially, I don't have any idea what the people who work for me do. Reagan will say this famously, the key part here being that government, as he'll say in a different speech, is not the solution to the problem, but government is the problem. Ronald Reagan runs to be the head of the United States government on the idea that the United States government needs to be, in many ways, dismantled or at least wildly scaled back. One of his top supporters will say, Grover Norquist, will say that government needs to be shrunk down to the size where it can be strangled in the bathtub, using this image of killing a baby for the government. Reagan's economic policy is called supply-side economics. The idea here that we stimulate the supply side or the manufacturers, the businesses. We don't stimulate the demand side or the consumers. They argue trickle-down economics. If we give money to the top, to the wealthiest in the economy, it will trickle down to everyone else. They argue that taxes have gotten too high and they're choking out economic growth. That businesses look at the tax structure, decide, well, they're going to tax so many of my profits. Why make money anyway? They proposed the Laffer curve, which says that you could raise revenue from taxes by cutting taxes. There's no evidence of this before or after the Reagan experiment here, but still it's presented today as if it's a realistic concept. They do cut taxes on the rich and corporations in an attempt to stimulate the economy in the early 1980s. In 1981, government spending is cut by $40 billion, and this is coupled with a 30% tax cut for the richest Americans and corporations. Congress actually gets that cut down to 25%, but it's still an enormous tax cut. Republicans are united, and they're going after disorganized Democrats who really don't quite know how to respond to this renewed attack. And then the scandals begin to trickle out. James Watt, the secretary of the one of Reagan's secretaries, will open up public land for development. The EPA is filled up with appointees from the very businesses they're supposed to be regulating, and they effectively quit doing their job until many members of the board get indicted for taking bribes. Reagan's policies to stimulate the economy fail. In 1982, the economy slumps into its worst depression since the Great Depression. Unemployment hits 11%. But in 1983, we begin to see some signs of recovery. It goes to 8.3%, unemployment does. And inflation falls below 5% for the first time in years. And in that 1 year, GDP grows by 3.6% in a single year. And Reagan and his supporters declare success. Why did this happen? Well, economists today point to tight money programs instituted under Jimmy Carter, which eventually began to bring inflation's rate down. Probably a more important factor was the collapse of OPEC, who ended their embargoes around this time, and oil began to return to the American market much cheaper than it had been before. And also, what's rarely talked about is after Reagan cut those taxes in 1981 and cut government spending, he will spend the next 7 years of his presidency raising taxes and increasing government spending. He'll raise taxes 11 times after that initial cut. And he'll raise government spending, particularly military spending, by billions and billions of dollars, creating a massive budget deficit in the process. But regardless of the reason, during the mid-1980s, we do see significant economic growth. One example of this would be the Dow Jones Industrial Average, which jumps from 777 in August of 82 to over 2,000 just 5 years later, which will be the beginning of its path of continued growth all the way up through the Clinton presidency in 2000. Ultimately, though, there will be major problems with the economic growth that does occur. For one thing, it will overwhelmingly go to the wealthiest people in the nation. Working class people will see their wages grow essentially not at all, while the rich will become dramatically richer. If you want to hear an incredible critique of Reagan's economic policies, you should check out Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five's The Message and actually listen to all the words. Also a great turning point and a key moment in the evolution of rap music. The other problem was deficits. Reagan spent enormous amounts of money that America simply didn't have. He had promised when he was elected that he would balance the budget. But Reagan actually ran America into more debt in 8 years than in all of U.S. history. This is modified as percentage of GDP, but in the total amount, it was more than all of U.S. history. It was America's biggest deficit. Previously, it had been $66 billion in 1976. Under Reagan, it would be over $100 billion annually. Reagan's highest deficit will be $268 billion. And the national debt, which was $907 billion when Reagan came into office in 1980, will be $3.5 trillion at the end of the Bush administration, Reagan's vice president, who continues his economic program. Well, why? Well, one thing is true is that entitlements are rising as the population ages. As the baby boomers get older, there are more people qualifying for Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, that sort of thing. Another is the massive tax cuts. If we decrease revenue, we're going to increase debt. And even though Reagan had promised to cut government spending, in reality, he had exploded government spending, particularly on a military buildup that he believed was necessary to show the Soviets who was boss. Reagan did cut many programs for the poorest and least powerful members of society. He cut veterans' benefits, which was particularly devastating immediately after the Vietnam War. He cut programs to feed the poor, to help kids go to school, things like this. Conservatives began calling for a balanced budget amendment, but that goes nowhere. Another great musical critique of the Reagan years is Bruce Springsteen's Born in the USA. If you've never listened to the words to that, you really should, and we will in class.